Environmental regulations in Texas. While Texas is subject to the same EPA regulations as any other state, it also has its own state regulations. These regulations address Texas-specific environmental issues, primarily revolving around the energy and agricultural sectors. The Texas Environmental Health and Safety (EHS) Audit Privilege Act allows companies to voluntarily disclose their intent to audit and put in writing any violations they may have. This grants the company limited evidentiary privilege, protecting them in civil and administrative cases. It does not protect them in federal cases. While this act is not supposed to protect reoffending companies or those causing large amounts of harm, the regulatory authority in Texas, the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, or TCEQ, has a long history of allowing corporations to sweep environmental failures under the rug. In fact, in 2021, there were 5,362 excess emission events, and only 16% had issued findings, and only 19 individual cases had corrective actions. Environmental regulations are divided into major and minor emission source categories. Major source refers to sources that produce over a defined amount of emissions or pollutants. Minor sources produce under that defined amount. States must abide by at least the EPA levels, but can choose to set their major source permits to those that produce less than the EPA standard levels. Texas abides by the EPA levels. The EPA defines these amounts as a stationary source or group of stationary sources that emit 10 tons per year or more of a hazardous pollutant, or 25 tons or more of a combination of hazardous air pollutants. In Texas, some corporations avoid the strenuous and often public action of applying for a major source permit by dividing their major source facility into minor permits, which are easier and cheaper for them to achieve. An example of this would be the Intercontinental Terminals Company, who wanted to expand their tank farm and terminal on the Houston Ship Channel in 2014. Having to remain under the 25 tons of pollutant, the company obtained one round of permits for its first group of chemical tanks, which produced 24.9 tons of hazardous emissions. In 2014, it asked for a second permit for another tank that would also be producing 24.9 tons of emissions a year. Since they are technically under the 25-ton EPA limit, they would not need a major source permit. In 2017, it got a third, even larger permit, bringing its total source emissions up to 147 tons per year. Since minor source permits do not require public input or federal government oversight, there have been cases where companies will face backlash when applying for major source permits, void their major source permit applications, then apply and often receive minor source permits. Often, when these companies go over their minor source emission levels, they go unpunished. This was the case for a Gulf Coast liquefaction plant, who applied for a minor source permit to release 6 tons of nitrogen oxides, then released more than 120 tons in its first year of operation. By allowing these companies to receive minor source permits, the voices of everyday citizens being subjected to the repercussions of these emissions are effectively being silenced. Texas has maintained this stance on environmental regulations for a few reasons. When these strict regulations go enforced, they often decrease the number of businesses willing to operate in that area, effectively creating a new barrier to enter the market. By easing these barriers, Texas is able to entertain a booming and competitive market. These less stringent regulations also allow the energy and agricultural sectors to move with more ease, allowing Texas to remain a top energy producer. With the large influx of new people to Texas, these regulatory practices work to allow faster urban expansion. The population of Texas is growing twice as fast as the national average, which requires the proper infrastructure to accommodate them. This means that the state needs to be able to build new roads, homes, and replace water infrastructure quickly and efficiently. Some construction companies view regulations as a barrier that would cause them to be slower, which may prevent them from being able to build fast enough to keep up with the growing population. In Texas, agriculture accounts for 9.1% of the state's GDP, or about $186.1 billion. This is almost twice the amount of the entire GDP of Idaho. With stricter environmental regulations, Texas may lose farms, which could cause significant harm to not only the Texas economy, but the U.S. economy as a whole. Texas leads the way in cattle ranching and is the top beef producer in the entire country. Being such a large state, it also has the most acreage of farmland compared to any other state. Limiting the agricultural sector in Texas could potentially affect worldwide food production. On top of all of this, Texas is the largest energy producer in the entire country. In 2021, Texas produced 43% of the country's oil, 25% of its natural gas, and 26% of its wind-powered electricity. These numbers come not only from the land itself, but the regulations that allow the energy sources to be extracted from the land. With all of these benefits, it is important to remember that there are vast consequences. While Texas may produce the most energy, it also has a lot of hazardous waste discharge into their waterways. This often leads to large toxic cyanobacteria algae blooms. This is not the only problem faced, as the companies have also released large amounts of plastic into waterways and have drained aquifers and lakes of their water. The weak regulatory practices have led to high levels of air pollution in Texas urban areas. These problems culminate in adverse health effects for Texas residents due to high pollutant exposure. These effects are not faced universally, as the state has also struggled with a long history of environmental racism. The effects on Texas wildlife and plants must also be considered. Texas may lead the way in agriculture and energy, but it also leads the way in hazardous waste discharge. In 2012, Texas released 34 million toxicity-weighted pounds of hazardous material into its waterways. This is 30 times the amount of any other state. While there are many sources for this pollution, the top polluter is the Pilgrim's Pride Corporation. This corporation is a chicken slaughterhouse and frying company. In 2020, the corporation released 2.7 million pounds of nitrate compounds into local waterways. These nitrate compounds can feed cyanobacteria colonies and spur their growth in local waterways. Cyanobacteria colonies are often found in areas with warm, low-flow water with large amounts of nutrients. These nutrients often come from agricultural runoff. Algae blooms are toxic to humans and wildlife and even cause oxygen depletion in waterways. When there is oxygen depletion, wildlife and other plants cannot survive in the waterway, causing areas with no life besides the algae, or dead zones. Harmful algae blooms have been found on Lady Bird Lake every year since 2019 and have been linked to the death of several dogs. The algae is toxic to consume and can cause severe harm to humans and animals alike. Toxic algae is not the only problem faced by Texas waterways. There's also the problem of nurdles, plastic pellets often used in the production of larger plastic products. The Formosa Point Comfort plant has been illegally dumping nurdles into local waterways for decades. The plant has over 700 violations and counting. They were sued by the local community and had to pay the largest settlement ever recorded under the Clean Water Act to private individuals, $250 million. The company regularly self-reports its violations to the TCEQ. In 2022, environmentalists had hoped that when the TCEQ publicly drafted a regulation that would limit the discharge of plastic waste. Their hopes were quickly dashed when the draft was scrapped after a pushback by several major chemical companies. Environmental regulations should not just protect the water, but also work to limit air pollution. There has been limited success in Texas to protect its citizens, and the state consistently ranks 9th in the country in daily density of fine particulate matter pollution. Texas has issued permits to 8 of its major polluters, with some of the permits not even requiring emissions monitoring, but instead relying on self-reporting. These permits have faced pushback from citizens and the EPA, but are consistently reissued. In 2022, the Martin Lake Power Plant released 13.3 million metric tons of greenhouse emissions. This is equivalent to the amount of greenhouse gases that 3.2 million cars would produce in a year, or about the populations of Austin and Houston combined. Again, this is one power plant. Urban areas like Houston face consistent problems with smog. New construction regularly rips up plants that anchor dirt, causing dust storms, further exacerbating air quality problems. The health costs of pollution is numerous. The aforementioned Martin Lake Power Plant has been linked to the premature deaths of at least 4,100 excess deaths in the local community from 1990 to 2020. In 2016 alone, 8,405 premature deaths were linked to exposure to particulate matter under 2.5 microns in size. Death is not all that pollution has been linked to. Low birth weight, an increased risk of stroke, non-fatal lung cancers, increased risk of Alzheimer's disease, and asthma were all reported in connections to this type of pollution. When water pollution is factored in, the increased amounts of lead, arsenic, radiation, and other pollutants have been linked to increased risks of cancer, damage to the brain and nervous system, hormonal disruption, pregnancy complications, and other health problems in Texas citizens. Some of the pollutants are not released directly into the water by corporations, but are instead leached out of the aging water infrastructure by chemicals within the water. The aging infrastructure does more than just poison its people. It also leads to a loss of precious resources. Massive leaks have occurred throughout the entire system, adding further strain to a system already struggling to properly manage its water supply. By 2030, Texans could be headed towards a massive water shortage. This comes as nearly half of the water supplies in Texas are used for irrigation, being then followed by municipal use. Water is not the only resource being potentially mismanaged. Overgrazing of land has led to an increased risk of topsoil erosion, causing problems for future farmers and leading to higher levels of particulate matter pollution. Land fragmentation has also crippled native wildlife and plant populations. Species like the golden cheeked warbler, Barton Creek salamander, and the whooping crane have faced serious population decline due to habitat fragmentation. Others have also faced population decline due to an increased usage of certain pesticides and fungicides, which can lead to a buildup of harmful chemicals in many species, eventually surpassing toxic levels and often proving to be fatal. When initially measured in the environment, many pesticides and fungicides do not surpass the known toxicity levels. As animals feed on infected plants and insects, the pesticides build up inside of their bodies. This is even a problem for turkey vultures feeding on animals that have been shot by lead ammunition. The more affected animals they feed on, the more the toxin builds up within their bodies. Animals do not bear this loss alone. Many plants in Texas have also faced decreasing population levels. In Texas, 23 plant species have been deemed endangered, 5 is threatened, and over 200 have been deemed species of concern. This includes one of my personal favorite plants, the Texas poppy mallow. Other species include the Texas trailing phlox, black lace cactus, the ashy dogweed, the Pesos sunflower, and Texas wild rice. These losses are primarily spurred by overdevelopment, drought, and habitat fragmentation. Many effects of environmental degradation and weak policy are not felt universally. Texas has a long history of targeting and environmentally segregating Hispanic and Black communities. Initially, these policies were enforced by redlining, but were then later reinforced by infrastructure. Factories, highways, and containment zones have been purposefully and masterfully built to more directly harm communities of color. The Houston Ship Channel has been polluting Hispanic and Black communities since the abolition of slavery. This has devastating consequences for the health of these communities. The average lifespan of minority communities in some part of the state are up to 20 years shorter than the life expectancy of primarily white neighborhoods that are just 15 miles away. Often these communities are targeted because they are seen as less likely to have the means to fight back and because of decades of racist policies. Overall, the weak implementation of environmental regulations in Texas has led to a degradation of water, air, and soil quality, causing human, animal, and plant harm and loss of life. In saying that, it does also allow for better economic growth and temporary population growth. These policies have also allowed Texas to remain a top energy producer and an integral part of the U.S. agricultural industry. The unfair application of these policies has led to direct harm in minority communities, shortening lifespans and increasing health complications, including reproductive health, certain cancers, and lung diseases. Long-term application of these policies likely does more harm than benefit to Texas communities.